Hey everyone, it's Chris. In my last video, I ranked the classes in the 2024 Player's Handbook by their ability to do single target damage over 20 levels. And that was a pretty big video. And what I want to do now is add some nuance to those findings because those kind of give you a conglomeration of an entire career of a character. I figure that it is worthwhile to do a little bit more of a deep dive into each tier of play. So I'm going to be doing 4 more videos, one for each tier of play. Today I will cover tier 1. That is levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now if you're playing in a campaign, it's a good chance you won't spend a whole lot of time in tier 1, but if you are playing one-shots, I think there are more published one-shots for tier 1 than any other tier of play. So it does see a lot of play. It's also where most campaigns begin. So if you want to deliver good single target damage, the answers for which classes are best at level 1 are very different than level 10 or level 15. Very, very different. In fact, we see some classes really excel at this tier and not do well in other tiers of play, and vice versa. So we're going to be going over our tier 1 damage numbers, and what I'm going to be doing is separating them into categories. So I'll be looking at base builds first. Those are builds where I do not include a subclass. Now, if obviously you're going to have a subclass on your character, but a lot of subclasses do not increase damage. If you select a subclass that does not increase damage, these are the numbers you should expect. And I am going to be ranking them into tiers, which you should see up on your screen right now. A tier means they will do an average of 13 to 15 points of damage over those 4 levels. So I take the I calculated damage for all 20 levels for all the builds. And what I did is I took the first 4 levels, added them together, divided by 4 to give me a tier 1 ranking. So if they get 13 to 15 points of damage around, that is great damage for those levels. And if they do 10 to 12, that's good damage for those levels. And that's a B tier. C tier is 7 to 9. That's okay. I mean, we're talking about, maybe half what the A tier does. And then D is 4 to 6. And that's just not good. If you're doing 4 damage around, and one of these builds will do 4 damage around, that is less than a third of 15 damage around. Do you really feel like you are contributing at all at that point? I don't know. That's up to you. I am just here to give you the information. You can do what you want with it. So, with those tier rankings out of the way, I want to start going over our information. So, we're going to begin with base builds, and I'm going to start with base builds that use 2 hands for attacks. So, that could be holding a greatsword. That could be holding 2 weapons and doing 2-weapon fighting, though there are rules within the game for potential weapon juggling, so you can exploit 2-weapon fighting while wearing a shield. And that is between you and your table and your DM, how you guys feel about that. I am not going to be presenting it that way in this video, and I'm not going to tell you how to play. Okay? So where I'm going to put them, I'm going to put them with 2-handed melee. So the base builds for 2-handed melee that I did are the Warlock base Blade Pact Greatsword. So just took Greatsword and Blade Pact, and it ended up with 8 damage around average, which puts it in C tier. Then we have the Fighter base Greatsword. This one does a little bit more damage at 9, and that gets it to C tier. The Fighter gets good stuff, but not a whole lot of good stuff at those low levels. Action Surge is good, but other classes are getting advantage or they're getting smites, and Action Surge just doesn't quite keep up to those in terms of damage. Now we're up to B tier, and Paladin base Greatsword gets to 10. That's just 1 higher than the Fighter Greatsword, so it's not a big difference, but that's things like Smite coming into play. And that gives him to B tier. And I think I used a couple Divine Favors as well on that one. And that was all assuming 4 combats, 4 rounds per combat. Then that brings us to the Monk base Quarterstaff, tier 1, and Unarmed in tier 2, 3, and 4. So with this build, what I assumed is in tier 1 that we would use a Quarterstaff using the Versatile property to give us a D8 base damage. and that means using two hands. So the monk will not be in the two-handed melee when I get into my next videos for tier 2 or 2, 3, and 4 because they'll be unarmed. Now they won't be wearing a shield, but they will have hands free for grappling or shoving or that kind of thing. So I do think there's an advantage there, so it's better to compare them to like builds at those higher levels. But at this point, they're using both hands for the quarterstaff. 11 points of damage, a little bit more than the Paladin base Greatsword. You notice here we're going up 1, 1, 1, 1, 8, 9, 10, 11. And now we're going to go to 12. With the Barbarian base Greatsword, this is our best Greatsword damage at tier 1, B ranking, 12 points of damage. And then we get to our A tier, and we only have one A tier in terms of base builds in tier 1. And that is the Ranger base, Hunter's Mark, and 2 weapon fighting, and that jumps by 2 up to 14. That's our highest base damage. And the Ranger, definitely is the class that it depends so much on tier of play, because here at tier 1, not only are they the best damage, they're significantly the best damage. So if you want to do the most damage you can in tier 1, a Ranger is the way to go. And use 2 weapon fighting and Hunter's Mark. And this one didn't use dual wielder or anything. I took defensive duelist at level 4, and I got the best damage numbers for any of the non-subclass builds that I did. And I technically did 2 Ranger builds, but they are both the same in tier 1. They used Hunter's Mark, 2 weapon fighting. Let's move on to one-handed melee. Now I only did 2 base builds for one-handed melee, but we'll have a lot more when we get into builds that use subclasses. But for the base builds, I had the Warlock base True Strike Shillelagh and the Fighter base Longsword, and they both scored 7. So neither of them did great, but they're both technically in C tier, the low end of C tier. 7 is the minimum that you needed to get to C tier, so they're almost in D. They're not going to do great. Neither of them are going to do great at this level, and it doesn't really matter which one you do. They're going to have about the same amount of damage. Now let's talk about ranged combat. Now ranged combat can include all kinds of things. You could shoot a longbow or a crossbow, or potentially throw in weapons, or potentially spells. So there's a lot of things here. The worst one that I did, and this is the worst one of all the builds I did in tier 1 in terms of single target damage, is the Druid base spells build. Largely I used cantrips and clouded daggers and 4 points of damage. It's just not good at all. And then just above them, Bard base spells build was 6. Tier 1 is not great for spells. We all know that. In terms of damage, I mean, spells are very useful for other things. There's great ritual spells at level 1 if you're a wizard. But in terms of delivering damage, Then we get into our C tier, and we get the Warlock base Eldritch Blast. So if you do want to do damage with spells, that's probably that's your second best choice with 7. So it does squeak into C tier. Then we get the Ranger base Hunter's Mark Longbow. This is up to 8. So it's a little bit more than the Warlock using Eldritch Blast, but not a lot. And this is just Longbow and Hunter's Mark. And then I used, I think, a couple spell slots for Hail of Thorns. Then also in C, one higher is the Sorcerer base Blast spells, and that is 9 damage. And this is the highest one that I was able to get with spells. And 9 is on the upper end of C tier. And what I did was Witch Bolt on round 1, followed up by Firebolts on rounds 2, 3, and 4. And that is the best way to compile as much damage as you can with spell casting from all the ones that I looked at. And this is, I'm talking about single target damage here. Now we get into B tier, and we have 2 B tier builds that both are base classes that use range combat. And the first is the Rogue base light crossbow using True Strike. Now True Strike doesn't really add to your damage in tier 1. It just depends what ability score you're focusing on. but we do 11 points of damage. That's 2 higher than the sorcerer. And the only one that beat the rogue base light crossbow true strike for range damage at tier 1 is also a rogue base dagger thrower. This wasn't even intended to be one of my optimized builds, just kind of a build I did to see what would happen. And it is a rogue that uses the nick property from daggers, and it throws 2 daggers on its turn, and that's all it does. And the nick property is wasted on the first attack, and then you get the second attack because of nick. Gives you a second chance to apply sneak attack, and that got me to 12 points of damage per round on average in tier 1, which is the best range damage I was able to achieve. It also beats most two-handed melee builds. So yeah, rogues do good damage at low level. Now we're going to move on to builds where I use subclasses to increase the damage. And my worst result, optimized two-handed melee, College of Valor Greatsword. 6 points, D ranking. Yeah, it's just that marshals get a lot of other stuff that the Valabard just doesn't get. And bards do not have the spells to support melee. They do melee weapon use. They can at high levels, but that doesn't help you in tier 1. So they're just really bad at using a greatsword, and they do 6 points of damage around. So I would not recommend it. If you are going to be College of Valor, then I would probably wait to use a weapon until you get to your extra attack at level 6, honestly. And then Circle the Moon, that's Druid, is 7. Not great. Mainly, the way it works is level 1 and 2 is terrible, and then level 3 and 4 are a fair bit better. And so they kind of average out to low end of C. Next, we're going to have the Fiend Patron Greatsword build, and it doesn't matter whether you are using Strength or Charisma. In Tier 1, you're going to average a 9. So I technically did 2 builds. I'm going to need to separate them at higher levels, but at this point, they're basically the same, 9 points, and they are in a 3-way tie because the Psy Warrior Greatsword also has 9 points of damage, and the Eldritch Knight Greatsword also does 9 points of damage. So if you want to use a Greatsword, Fiend Patron, Blade Pact, Psy Warrior, Fighter, Eldritch Knight Fighter doesn't really make a difference. Next, B tier. We're going to jump by 3 points of damage here to the Oath of Vengeance Greatsword, which does 12. That's a big jump, and that is largely due to the fact that Oath of Vengeance is going to be able to, once per short rest, get advantage on their attacks. And that makes a big difference and brings them all the way up to 12. And now we're going to go to the A tier, and there are 5 builds that achieved A tier, all in optimized two-handed melee. So if you want to do the most damage in tier 1, two-handed melee, and choose one of these subclasses. First is Warrior of Shadow, using the quarterstaff, using the versatile property, 13 points of damage, A tier. The A tier is between 13 and 15. Next up, we have the Oath of Vengeance, dexterity-based paladin, using 2-weapon fighting, and that is 14. Tied with the Oath of Vengeance 2-weapon fighter is the Zealot barbarian, using a greatsword, also 14 points of damage. You can beat that. 2 different ways you can beat it. The first is be a berserker instead of a zealot, and that will get you up to 15. They do just a little bit more damage. Now, they don't have the zealot has some healing, self-healing, that the berserker does not have. So you'll have to decide if that 1 point of damage is worth giving that up. But if you're just worried about doing damage, the berserker will do the most for the barbarian. And tied with them, the Fey Wanderer Summoner 2-weapon fighter, which is Hunter's Mark and 2-weapon fighting, 15 points of damage. And so those 2 are tied for the top spots in Tier 1. So let's talk about one-handed melee. We're going to look at some shillelagh builds and some longsword builds. The lowest damage was the Eldritch Knight Shillelagh. If you want to use an Eldritch Knight and shillelagh, you will do good damage at high level. You will do bad damage at low level. I'm not sure 7 is, it's not quite what I call bad. It's decent, but it's definitely on the low end of decent. 7 is just barely what you need to get into C tier. Tied with them is the Celestial Patron, True Strike Shillelagh. So the Celestial Patron will eventually add the Charisma a second time, actually a third time to True Strike. At this point, they're already adding it twice through Agonizing Blast, and 7 points of damage, tied with the Eldritch Knight Shillelagh. Okay. Then we have the Champion using Shillelagh. They do more damage than either of them with 8 points. The Longsword outdamages Shillelagh at these low levels. The Battlemaster Longsword does 8, tied with the Champion Shillelagh. The Oath of Vengeance Longsword does 9, so 1 higher, and the high end of C. And then we're going to jump a little bit into B tier. The Zealot Longsword does 11, and the Berserker Longsword does 12. These are the most damage you're going to get with one-handed melee of all the builds that I did. They're both barbarians, of course, and it's just like with Greatsword. They're one separate, so Berserker does 1 more damage than the Zealot, but you'll have to decide if that's worth giving up the healing, okay? But, yeah, the Zealot and the Berserker both do great damage in Tier 1. And now we're going to talk about ranged combat, and this is where we're going to kind of finish up here. So in C tier, Archfey Patron Eldritch Blast does 8 points of damage. Then we have a little bit more damage with the Draconic Sorcerer Blast build, which does 9. Then we can outdamage that by playing a Ranger Beastmaster Longbow, which does 10. And tied with the Beastmaster Longbow is the Assassin with the Heavy Crossbow. I did a fighter dip on that one. That's how they have a heavy crossbow for 10 points of damage. So the most damage you're going to get at ranged, either Beastmaster Longbow or Assassin Heavy Crossbow. I will mention that the base Dagger Thrower for Rogue was 12. And I didn't add a subclass, so I would just, if you want the most damage you can get at range, if 20-foot range counts for you, if that's enough, then make the Dagger Thrower and just give it any subclass you want, and it will do more damage than either of these builds. Okay? Now that will not hold up at higher tiers, but in Tier 1, that's the case. So based on all that, who does the best damage in Tier 1? Well, the worst damage is the Druid with 4. Druids are not good single target damage dealers, especially without a subclass, especially in Tier 1. Followed by the Bard. The Bard does a little bit better, but still does pretty poor. So those are both in D tier. Then we have our C tiers. The Warlock is at the lowest of C tier with 8. The Sorcerer then is a little bit better with 9. That's thanks to innate sorcery, giving them advantage on some attack rolls. Then the Fighter is tied with the Sorcerer at 9. And basically I just put those in alphabetical order going down. And then we move up to B tier, and then we're at the Paladin with 10. Then above the Paladin is the Monk at 4th rank with 11. Then the Rogue in 3rd rank with 12. The Barbarian in 2nd place with 12. And the highest damage you can get in Tier 1 is the Ranger. Okay, so do Rangers suck? Not in Tier 1, they don't. In Tier 1, if you want to do single target damage, they are the class to choose. That will not hold up. In Tier 3, that won't be the case, for sure. There's a big change in power level for the Ranger, but in Tier 1, they're rocking it. You just got to think that, 2 free Hunter's Marks plus 2 spell slots at level 1, that is more spells than any other character can cast, even the full casters. And Hunter's Mark really works well in Tier 1 if you have the Nick property on a weapon. And so, yeah, you can do a lot of damage. You got to do 2 weapon fighting. And, yeah, so that is my Tier 1 scores. I hope you enjoyed it. Tier 2 is probably more relevant for, campaigns because you spend a lot of time in Tier 2. So that will be my next video. I expect people will be interested in that. So I hope you will join me for it. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.